There are places you know, deep in your gut, that are darker than you could ever imagine. Places that don't exist in the world of maps or street signs, but in the spaces between light and shadow. In every town, there's one, hidden in plain sight. In ours, it was that stretch of road. A lonely strip lined with twisted trees, long abandoned lots, and an unspoken dread. I used to walk it every night, on my way to the corner store, my mother's voice echoing in my head, "Go on, it's only a few blocks." But I never walked it without fear. By day, it was just another road, quiet and empty, nothing special. But at night? That was when the shadows seemed to deepen, clinging to the trees, stretching out as though they could swallow you whole. And each time I passed it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something hungry and waiting. It was the kind of terror you couldn't explain, but felt in every fiber of your being. Johnny Craig lived across the street from me. When we were kids, I barely noticed him. He was just a baby when I was playing with Andy, his older brother, so Johnny was never more than an afterthought. But I remember seeing him grow up. He played outside sometimes, ran around with a plastic sword or a toy car. He was one of those quiet kids, the kind who didn't stand out but wasn't invisible either. The night Johnny went missing felt eerily like every other night before it. The sun had barely slipped behind the horizon when I last saw him, his small frame silhouetted against the dimming sky as he kicked his ball across the cracked pavement. I was heading out to the store, just like I did most evenings, and as I passed his house, I waved at him, my mind occupied with the mundane task of picking up some milk. Johnny was absorbed in his game, lost in the carefree way that only children can be. He didn't notice me. I never imagined that would be the last time I'd see him alive. The evening went on, and by 9, the world had quieted down. The usual hum of neighborhood life had faded. But then I heard it, first a siren, then another, and then a whole chorus of them wailing through the night air. I froze at the sound, my stomach sinking into a pit. I could hear the heavy pounding of doors slamming, hurried voices in the street. The air had shifted, turned cold and tense, as if the town collectively held its breath. Johnny was missing. It wasn't a moment of panic, though. It wasn't until later, after the police had arrived in full force, that the gravity of it all hit me. At first, there was just confusion. His parents, frantic, called every neighbor, every friend, but no one had seen him after sunset. They said Johnny was supposed to come home hours ago. He'd been playing in the front yard, and then, nothing. Gone. And that's when the search began. I could hear the clatter of feet rushing down the street, neighbors shouting for help, the sirens getting closer. The police cars parked up and down the road, doors slamming in unison as officers, wearing tense expressions, quickly formed teams. Volunteers gathered, some from the neighborhood, others just passing through, drawn by the call for help. Flashlights flickered in the distance, casting jittery shadows along the pavement. People shouted his name. The darkness seemed to swallow it whole. I stood at my window, watching the frenzy unfold across the street. Andy, Johnny's older brother, was running frantically back and forth, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wild with disbelief. The grief was written in every line of his expression, and his hands shook as he held onto his parents, trying to make sense of what had happened. His mother, Cheryl, stood in the middle of the yard, her hands clutched to her chest like she was holding her heart together. Her eyes were bloodshot, tears streaking down her face, but she didn't seem to notice. She kept calling Johnny's name, over and over, as if hearing it would bring him running back, his laugh filling the empty space of the night. But it didn't. His father, Dan, paced across the front yard, a grim look on his face, trying to keep it together. He barked instructions to the neighbors who had gathered, trying to remain calm for their sake. But there was nothing calm about it. There was a panic behind his eyes, a dread he was doing his best to keep hidden. Every few minutes, he would glance up the road as if hoping, praying for someone to bring Johnny back. But nothing. Just the hum of the searchlight sweeping across the trees, the bark of commands echoing through the air, the muted cries of Johnny's family breaking the silence like shards of glass. The search grew wider as the night wore on, volunteers and officers spreading out into the woods, pushing deeper into the darkness. But no one spoke of where they were searching, at least not openly. It was the road, the stretch of lonely trees at the edge of town. The place everyone knew was dangerous. The place where, if you wandered just a little too far, the dark would consume you whole. But no one wanted to admit it. I knew. And my gut twisted in agony. I knew the road. I had walked it countless times, each step heavier than the last as my mind filled with the thought of what could be hiding there. I had imagined it as a child, something that lurked just out of sight, waiting for a moment of weakness. But now, that fear was real. The thing I had feared all my life was no longer a figment of my imagination. It was real. And Johnny, in his innocence, had wandered too close. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about Johnny, what had happened to him, what he might have felt walking down that road. Had he known? Did he feel the same dread that I had, the way the air changed when darkness overtook the land? The thought gnawed at me, keeping me awake as I lay in bed, the moon casting faint shadows through my window. The sounds outside the house were getting fainter, the searchers' calls growing more distant as they scattered, scouring the woods, the fields, the roads, and yet, I knew, they weren't calling loud enough. They weren't calling in the right place. It felt as though the entire town was holding its breath. The voices of the searchers grew more desperate as the hours ticked by. But there was no sign of Johnny. By the time the clock had struck 2 in the morning, I was shaking with dread. The night had stretched on into something unending, like the darkness itself had clung to the town, refusing to let go. I kept hearing things, the cracking of twigs, the faint rustle of leaves, the feeling of something lurking just beyond my line of sight. But every time I forced myself to look, there was nothing. And still, Johnny didn't return. The hours bled into one another. With each passing minute, the search turned from frantic hope to grim determination. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the light didn't feel like salvation. It felt like the quiet before a storm. The town was exhausted, but no one wanted to stop.
Johnny's parents hadn't stopped. Andy hadn't stopped. No one had given up hope yet. But I knew deep down, I knew that if they didn't find him by morning, they wouldn't find him at all. Not alive anyway. And then, just before the sun rose, the worst happened.
The police found Johnny in the woods, just beyond the trees where the road disappeared into shadow. But it wasn't like any search and rescue operation. This wasn't a simple case of a missing child. No, what they found in those woods was something far worse, something that could never be undone. The first thing they saw was his shoe. Just one. Half buried in the dirt near the edge of the trees, a small, inconspicuous thing, like a forgotten toy. But as they ventured further, they discovered what had really happened, and they wished they hadn't. The body was found a few yards beyond the trees, lying in a grotesque heap, twisted mockery of the boy who had once been full of life. Johnny wasn't just lost. His body had been torn apart, shredded with such brutality that even the officers, hardened by years of gruesome scenes, couldn't stomach it. His clothes were barely intact, soaked with blood, his small frame broken in ways no one could explain. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, his face a mask of horror. The word, mutilated, didn't even come close to describing it. His body was crushed, as if something enormous had pressed down on him, breaking him open like a rag doll, but that wasn't even the worst part. No, the worst part was the way he had been torn. Like something had ripped him apart, clawing at his skin, slashing deep gashes into his flesh, rending muscle from bone with a savage hunger. His torso was a mangled mess, a brutal, jagged wound running from his stomach to his chest, the organs spilling out, half-eaten. His face, his once familiar face, had been mauled beyond recognition. His eyes were still wide open, but they were lifeless, empty, a final testament to his terror. His mouth was twisted into a silent scream that would never be heard. The scene was not just one of death, it was a grotesque display of something monstrous, a violent act that was far beyond the capabilities of any animal in the woods. I didn't see it myself, but I didn't need to. I heard it from Andy first. He came to my house in the early hours of the morning, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. They said it was an animal did this. I could hear the disbelief in his voice, but even as he spoke, I could see it in his eyes. He knew. He knew, just like I did, that it wasn't an animal. No animal could have done this. Not like this. Not with that kind of malice, that kind of rage. The thing in the wood. The thing I had always feared. The nightmare I had imagined as a child, the one I thought could only live in my head. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And now, it was real. It had taken Johnny. The whole town was in shock. At first, there was silence, no one could speak. Then, the whispers started, low murmurs shared behind closed doors and between neighbors who could no longer look each other in the eye. They tried to make sense of it, tried to explain the unexplainable. They said it was an animal, that some wild beast had wandered out of the woods and done this to him. But everyone knew. The children, the parents, the old folks who had lived in the town for years, they all knew what had really happened. Something had been out there, something that had been waiting. Something that hunted in the dark, in places like that stretch of road where no one dared to go after nightfall. That's where it thrived, where it stalked and waited, hungry for whoever was unlucky enough to cross its path. And Johnny had been its prey. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop imagining him, walking down that road, feeling that creeping sense of something waiting just beyond the trees, that same feeling I had always known deep down. Had Johnny felt it too? Had he sensed it coming? Or had he just been an innocent boy, too young to understand the danger that lurked in the shadows? No one talked about the woods anymore. People stopped mentioning the road, as if speaking about it aloud would somehow make it worse. But the truth was, we all knew. It wasn't just some wild animal. It wasn't some random tragedy. There was something out there. Something that had been living in the dark corners of our minds, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now it had taken Johnny. The whole town felt the weight of it, the silence after the screams, the grief hanging heavy in the air like fog. Johnny's parents, his mother still clinging to the hope that somehow this was all a mistake, but his father was broken. Andy couldn't speak. None of us could. The vigil started almost immediately, people lighting candles and praying for the soul of the boy who had been lost to the darkness. But no prayer would bring Johnny back. No light could chase away the horror of what had happened. What really happened? We were all left to wonder, what else was out there? And what, if anything, could protect us from the thing that had taken him? The town was never the same again. The fear, that deep-rooted terror, had been awakened. And we all knew, it wasn't over. The thing in there was still out there. And it would wait, as it always had, for the next innocent soul to wander too close. They never found the creature, of course. Not in the trees, not in the dark, not anywhere. The police wrote it off as a wild animal, a freak accident, but even they couldn't hide the terror in their eyes. The town took action. They tore down the trees. They put up street lights. They did everything they could to erase the road's darkness, to turn it into something normal. But I knew. I knew the thing hadn't just disappeared. It was out there, somewhere, waiting. And it would wait until the next child walked alone down that road. I haven't been back down that stretch of road since. I can't. Not after what happened to Johnny. I see the lights now, where the trees once were, and I try to convince myself that it's safer. But I know the truth. That thing is still out there. It's just waiting. And it won't stop until it finds someone else to devour. I hear the stories now, about kids who go missing in other towns, in places just like ours. People dismiss them, of course, it's just an animal, they say. But I know better. I can hear it in their voices. They are scared. Because they know. It's only a matter of time before it comes for you.